art is about expression. An expression of ideas, an expression of emotion, an expression of passion. But that passion is something often hard to express under the realities of what it takes to make said art. Time, skill, and most importantly, money. The most prolific artist of our generation could be walking among us, but if the stars never align in such a way that gives them the opportunity to make said art, we'd never get to see what they have to say. This can be aided with businesses that specialize in producing art, whether it be comics, music, movies, which mitigates the financial pressure put on the artists and allows them to just create. That comes with its own problems, however. The more somebody invests in something, the more they're going to want to have a say in how it's handled. It's their money after all. And so whatever the output, it'll typically have to be filtered through the voices of countless others throughout the pipeline, all of which may have completely different views on what they want from the piece. There are artists out there who can completely accept this, and are willing to make creative changes even if it means not getting to execute their pure vision, whereas others are a lot more protective of their work and not willing to budge on the matter, which in turn may result in them getting less opportunities as word spreads of them being hard to work with. There is a balance, though, that can be made with these two approaches. Listening and accepting different interpretations of what your work should be, while still making sure the integrity of the piece isn't tampered with. We see this nowhere more than in the land of Hollywood, where making art is all about one thing: compromise. How would you feel if you had just created the biggest thing ever? Something beloved by folks of all ages around the entire planet. Something that transcends time, something that transcends culture. Something that will go down in history as one of the most popular pieces of anything ever created. That thought often comes to my mind when thinking of Stephen Hillenburg, a marine biologist from Oklahoma who, on a complete whim, wound up creating one of the most recognizable cartoon characters in history. And their name is Mrs. Puff. Now, that's not to say the idea for SpongeBob came from nowhere, definitely not. Instead, it was the result of different concepts that had been brewing in his mind for over a decade. With his fascination for both art and the sea, Hillenburg had gotten a job at the once called Orange County Marine Institute in California, where he then aimed to combine these passions through a comic series called The Inner Tidal Zone, featuring different lessons about the sea taught through the lens of anthropomorphic sea life, and co-hosted by a character he had named Bob the Sponge. However, with no comic publisher taking interest in his project, along with seeking out a change in career, Stephen decided that he wanted to go back to school, but this time for animation. After enrolling in Cal Arts and through a series of connections he had made during that time, Hillenburg had landed a role at Nickelodeon, which eventually gave him the opportunity to pitch his own show. A show that would once again combine these two passions of art and sea life. A show called SpongeBob SquarePants.
SpongeBob SquarePants coming Saturday morning in 2 weeks. Be there and be square.
With the series premiering directly after the Kids' Choice Awards in 1999, it's no surprise the show would become an immediate hit, resonating with not only kids, but a lot of adults too. Everybody loved SpongeBob and resonated with the show's bizarre and surreal sense of humor. Okay, well, maybe not everyone. Either way, Nickelodeon knew they had a hit on their hands. And so what's the obvious next course of action? The SpongeBob SquarePants movie. And so 2004 saw just that. You really had to be there when the SpongeBob movie came out. At the ripe old age of 2, this was the first film I was ever taken to see in theaters. And I barely remember it. I have the vaguest memories of seeing the giant poster for it outside my local Omniplex, but at the same time, maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, wishing I could remember being there for such a monumental moment in cartoon history. It's one of those things I'll never know. What I do remember, however, is the fact that every kid I knew was talking about the SpongeBob movie for years. It was a staple of sleepovers, references, it was even voted for as the movie our teacher would play on the last day of school before we went home for summer. She decided to play it with only 10 minutes left in class, but we got through the intro at least. Point is, I don't think SpongeBob has ever, or will ever, be as huge as it was when that first movie released. Nick were riding high off the success of the first 3 seasons, and this only added to the mania. To a lot of parents' dismay, SpongeBob had become unavoidable. For Stephen Hillenburg, this must have been insane. His little show about a sea sponge had exceeded any and all expectations placed on it, and had quickly become the biggest piece of children's programming at the time, cultivating a huge fan base of kids and adults, and most importantly for Nickelodeon, becoming a merchandising juggernaut. That's like the Hollywood dream right there. He came in, made an immediate hit, and got a movie which more than tripled its budget at the box office. How must that feel? You would just have to be on cloud nine, right? Well, how would you react if I had read out a quote to you Hillenburg had made just 12 days before the premiere of his very first feature-length film? When an interviewer for the New York Times had mentioned flipping through a flight catalog and being met with a swarm of various SpongeBob products from watches to CD players, Hillenburg visibly winced and responded, "I looked at the same catalog and it was like..." At first it's both weird and flattering, and then, after a while, you get tired of seeing it. It loses preciousness after a while. One night, I was really beat. We worked really late and went to get food at some takeout place, and I leaned over against this gumball machine, just exhausted. And there was a SpongeBob looking back at me. And it's just like, oh brother. I think about this quote a lot. I can't imagine it's the reaction most would have upon seeing their own creation resonate this much with people all over the world. It's just interesting to consider that this is where Steven's headspace was at less than 2 weeks before what was going to be the biggest moment of his career, the end goal. Yet, you get this idea that for him, it was all kind of a nuisance. And this is not an isolated quote. Sherm Cohen, who had a hand in most of the series' most well-remembered episodes, was also asked about his reaction to the show becoming this merchandising powerhouse, in which he replied, "I was really excited, but Steven looked grim." Hearing these comments started to put a lot into perspective with the SpongeBob franchise, mainly in regards to what it's become today and how Nickelodeon's treatment of the series appears to only go against Stephen Hillenburg's wishes for the show. In interviews throughout the years when asked various questions about the different directions SpongeBob could take in the future, one of these involved the topic of spin-offs, when a new series releases focusing on a character or setting from an already existing one. On this topic, Hillenburg was quoted saying, "The show is about SpongeBob, he's the core element, and it's about how he relates to the other characters. Patrick by himself might be a bit too much, so I don't see any spin-offs." Sounds like a pretty firm stance. And so understandably, a lot of folks find it disrespectful that in August 2020, Nickelodeon had announced their brand new upcoming cartoon, The Patrick Star Show. The reaction to this was extremely negative, only compounded by the fact that 1 year prior, Nick had already announced an upcoming SpongeBob spin-off titled Camp Coral, which saw the main cast be aged down as we see their adventures in summer camp, seemingly disrespecting the lore in a lot of cases, such as having Sandy be a part of the series despite not meeting SpongeBob and friends until after the events of the pilot in the main show. People were quick to bring up another quote that was made, this time coming from Paul Tibbitt, the man who had taken over as showrunner for SpongeBob after Steven stepped down. Him saying, "Steve would always say to me, you know, one of these days they're gonna want to make SpongeBob babies. That's when I'm out of here." Paul further exacerbated the matter by making a tweet in response to Camp Coral's announcement, which read, "I do not mean any respect to my colleagues who are working on this show. They are good people and talented artists. But this is some greedy, lazy executiving right here. And they all know full well Steve would have hated this. Shame on them." What upset people most about this was the fact that Steven didn't even have the opportunity to give his reaction to the news. As just 1 year prior to Camp Coral's announcement on November 26, 2018, Stephen Hillenburg unfortunately died from ALS. The man responsible for the most popular children's character of the past 2 decades had just passed away at the incredibly young age of 57. To the internet, this all seemed like the biggest possible spit in the face you could give towards the guy who had a monumental hand in making your network as big as it was. You know, now it's no longer a case of Nickelodeon disrespecting Stephen Hillenburg's wishes, but his legacy. And so each time Steven's name is brought up today, no matter where, it'll always be followed by a myriad of people reminding us of what Nickelodeon did to his creation, and how scummy it was to wait until the man had died before going against his clear desires for SpongeBob. But is any of this warranted? Over the past few years, as the topic continues to be brought up, we've started to see more and more people out there come to defend Nickelodeon's decisions. Not in some attempt to blindly defend some $1 million company or anything, but instead to highlight that these accusations made on behalf of Steven, that he had such firm beliefs on the topic of SpongeBob's excessive merchandising or spin-offs, are completely unfounded and only takes away from being able to just appreciate his work, to enjoy what he did make and the stuff he was proud of without having to concern ourselves with what he would have thought of SpongeBob shows he isn't around to give his thoughts on. That speaking on behalf of a dead man, in and of itself, is also really scummy. Well, The truth of the matter is we can never know for sure how Stephen felt towards what Nickelodeon had done with SpongeBob. But that doesn't mean I don't have my theory. What happens when your creation outlives you? And what could you even do about it? To understand where Stephen's headspace must have been at during SpongeBob Mania, you really do have to understand first how big SpongeBob was. Because, like I said, he really was the biggest thing ever. I don't think there's any sense of exaggeration around that. I mean, this clip alone highlights how massive this character is, better than I ever could.
Since SpongeBob premiered in 1999, the show has generated over $13 billion in revenue from merchandising alone. And considering Viacom, Nickelodeon's parent company, earns about $13 billion of revenue per year, you could infer that SpongeBob alone has accounted for at least 5% of Viacom's total revenue since 1999. Keep in mind, that's not just 5% of Nickelodeon's revenue. That's 5% of the total revenue from every media property Viacom owns.
Nickelodeon paid attention to how quickly SpongeBob had built a fan base, and so understandably, he started turning up everywhere. This was a big risk on Nickelodeon's part, as when the network began, the higher-ups had always wanted to portray this image of a network for kids by kids. And a part of that image was not wanting their audience to feel like they were being constantly marketed to, like they're always trying to sell them something. Sure, that is what they were doing at the end of the day, but any kind of subtlety they took in their approach was thrown out the window as soon as SpongeBob blew up. There was simply too much money on the table to not take advantage of. And while we all know this would cause the eventual downfall of Nickelodeon as they'd forever continue to try and capture lightning in a bottle twice, you can't really blame them for choosing this route. Again, from a business standpoint, it just made sense. Nickelodeon's attempts to try and recapture SpongeBob's success would ultimately be futile. The only show, if there is one, that got anywhere close would be Butch Hartman's Fairly OddParents. But even then, despite consistently being number 2 throughout a majority of SpongeBob's airtime, it wasn't even a contest. Sure, a show like Fairly OddParents could bring in viewers. Even more viewers than SpongeBob for a time, but you just couldn't compete with what made SpongeBob so profitable. And it's all in the merchandising. SpongeBob is eye-catching, it's colorful, it's abstract. Every element from the world to the characters to the music was universal. SpongeBob could fit in any context, whether it be for kids, adults, girls, boys, deities. There was no market SpongeBob couldn't appeal to, which allowed it to snowball in the way it did. And the best part of all that is, it was by complete accident.
I really thought, I don't really have an idea that I'd want to torture myself over for several seasons. And then Martin was looking at the intertitle comic that I had, and he said, "What, are you crazy? This is your show right here."
I think what's most interesting about SpongeBob's success is that this was not a show designed by committee. This was not a show intended to be the biggest thing ever. It was just a simple idea created out of one man's passion for sea life. SpongeBob resonated so much with people because the show never felt like it was speaking down to an audience, and never felt like it was being directly targeted towards kids. The show simply emanated this vibe of a group of buddies getting together and writing whatever made them laugh, which seems to be a common trait shared by most creators of some of the biggest kids' cartoons.
Bubbles, it's a bow tie and it goes down here. And cologne, breath mints, and cufflinks, and some of these.
We never really made the show for kids. We always just made it for us.
For Stephen, SpongeBob was the perfect opportunity to share his passions with the world. His goal wasn't to make a show that would go on to get 300 episodes and 3 movies. I'm sure he couldn't even fathom the idea that SpongeBob would someday still be airing new episodes 25 years later. As far as he was concerned, he would get 1 season and that would be it. Little did he know. And so to Stephen, this excessive merchandising was not a part of the plan, and something he actually seemed pretty actively against, despite understanding this was just a natural part of show production, especially with kids. Most of the profits made in that business are from merchandise sales, and so Stephen knew this wasn't something he could fight. However, if they had to make all this merchandise for SpongeBob, then the least he could do was make sure it stayed true to his vision. There were various cases of this, especially around the time of the first movie, in particular in relation to deals made with Target and Burger King. Target wanted the tagline for their SpongeBob merchandise to be, "It's hip to be square," which Stephen was very against, as in his mind, SpongeBob would never care to be seen as hip, in which he offered the alternate tagline, "Dare to be square." A simple change, one not many people would even notice or care about, but to Stephen, that was everything. He was also very particular about their junk food tie-ins. He was fine with the likes of ice cream and candy because to him those were staples of everyone's childhoods. However, the likes of fast food was something he was extremely against pushing on kids. There's just one issue with that. When you're making an animated movie, you just gotta have the fast food tie-in. And so he succumbed to the pressure and allowed them to do a collaboration with Burger King, as long as it only involved SpongeBob toys that would come along with kids' meals. There were further complications, however, as Burger King had requested them change a shot of SpongeBob cooking on his grill, as Burger King burgers are flame broiled. Oh no! And so they wanted an animated shot of SpongeBob using the famous BK Flame Broiler trademarked. It was at this point Stephen put his foot down and said, SpongeBob uses a grill. Take it or leave it. I personally would have had more to say about this commercial, but I'm sure all this got tiring. Trying to make sure the integrity of his art stayed true by getting so involved in the merchandising of SpongeBob when, in reality, all he wanted to do was make the damn show. What's most interesting about this to me is that this is the exact opposite reaction most would have if put in Stephen's place. I imagine most of you out there could only dream of your passion project getting even 1/100th as popular as SpongeBob. And so there's a lot of people out there who would simply succumb to the network's pressure out of fear of being seen as someone difficult to work with, or losing the opportunity altogether. And, coincidentally, a creator just like this was only a couple booths down from Stephen in Nickelodeon studio.
Hey Hartfans.
As previously stated, a couple years after SpongeBob premiered, 2001 saw the release of a new Nicktoon called The Fairly OddParents, created by one Elmer Butch Hartman. I think it's funny that both of these shows ran so close together on the same network as their creators could not be any more different. Butch Hartman would frequently succumb to the pressures placed on him at Nickelodeon for the sake of not trying to rock their relationship, and as a result, they treated him extremely well. The guy got 4 original cartoons on Nick, and I think such a major part of that was them trusting that he would be a team player. However, in turn, I believe his art suffered in some cases. He was frequently adding new characters to the Fairly OddParents per request of the network as a way to boost ratings. Additions, fans would argue, went on to ruin the show. But to him, as long as they got another season, it was worth it.
This exec at Nickelodeon, who kind of ran the whole place, said, you know, we really love Fairly OddParents, we want to keep making the show. And I'm like, great, but we want you to add a new character in the show, kind of a foil for Timmy Turner. We want you to add a girl character in the show that would probably give him a problem. And that's really all I was asked.
His passion was for superheroes and action, yet after the relative failure and subsequent cancellation of his second cartoon, Danny Phantom, the Butch Hartman show I believe to be closest to the sort of thing he actually wanted to make, I think it almost scared him from ever trying to put his foot down again. I mean, hey, having any show in the air is better than none at all, right? For example, he had pitched a show to Cartoon Network about a group of crime-fighting mice, with a much more serious and darker aesthetic than he's known for. It was an idea that he seemed incredibly invested in. However, as soon as the network asked him to make it a comedy, he changed the entire thing at a second's notice.
They said, we want you to put SpongeBob in school and have parents. And I basically said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not my idea. My idea is that it's this kid that's an adult, and he has a job, and he lives in a house. He's autonomous from his parents. And Now, I want to make it clear that there's nothing inherently wrong with this approach, as it undoubtedly resulted in Butch Hartman having an extremely fruitful career. I think it's just as disrespectful to prop one person up by putting another down. But this is instead to point out and highlight that Stephen Hillenburg had the exact opposite mindset. Whereas Fairly OddParents was consistently number 2, to the point where you get the idea Butch resented SpongeBob for this.
Like, well, we're canceling your show because there's no sponge in it. And the show is just, it's kind of over and, it's not doing as well as that sponge show over there. I said, well, I had a sponge show. Well, why are you guys stopping it now? It's still not doing as well as the sponge show. The sponge show is our Mickey Mouse. Oh, hi, Pluto. Hi, Patrick. I'm SpongeBob.
Stephen Hillenburg, I'm sure, would have been ecstatic to see SpongeBob be knocked down a peg. To no longer feel the pressure that comes with having created the biggest thing ever. It just shows a difference in personality and mindset. Stephen was often described as an introverted guy who wanted to stay out of the limelight, whereas Butch reveled in it any chance he could. Butch would make sure he always had a dozen ideas at the ready, just in case he had the opportunity to pitch. Fairly OddParents came up with on the spot. Danny Phantom came from him hearing that Nick was looking for an action cartoon.
I just want to remind you all out there to always be ready. Always have another idea in your back pocket. Don't ever just have one idea. One idea can be moved aside, but if you have that other idea waiting right behind it, that might just be the one.
Whereas SpongeBob, in some form, was the only TV series that Stephen ever wanted to make. And again, that's not to discredit Butch Hartman or try to claim his approach or mindset was wrong in any way, of course not. But that, to me, is the fundamental difference that made SpongeBob stand out, why it remains unlike anything else. Butch Hartman is an ideas guy, whereas Stephen Hillenburg had an idea. All of this is to say, SpongeBob blowing up this much undoubtedly put immense pressure on Stephen, pressure he didn't ask for. When making a kids show that became as big as SpongeBob, your job is no longer just to make the episodes. It's overseeing merchandise, talking with networks about expansion in a way that doesn't go against your morals, making sure other companies don't license it out and then proceed to betray your vision. Suddenly it's video games and movies with interviews asking when's the sequel, and toys and clothing lines and fast food tie-ins. And at a certain point you must start to worry that in a way you've betrayed your integrity, that you've been forced to sell out. My biggest nightmare is that I'm going to be at the beach one day, and one of these dolls is going to wash up on the shore like garbage. It must be such a futile feeling. The reality is, Stephen could have been as vocally against doing any of this as he wanted, but that wouldn't have stopped Nickelodeon. Again, there was simply too much money to be made, and so whether or not Stephen was involved in that process was completely up to him. But he knew that at the very least with him being there, he could make things stay as true to SpongeBob as possible. We've seen similar situations happen many times. Acclaimed cartoonist Robert Crumb had created the popular Fritz the Cat character, which famous animator Ralph Bakshi had interest in directing a film adaptation of. Despite Crumb eventually not wanting to go through with the project, his wife had signed the contract that allowed production to go ahead against his will, with him infamously hating the final product. So much so that he went out of his way to make a new comic where he permanently killed the character, out of contempt and embarrassment for what was done to him. What's to say that if Stephen were against making a SpongeBob movie, then Nickelodeon wouldn't just make it anyway without his involvement? After all, when Nick first agreed to pick up SpongeBob, they obtained all ownership of the IP. They can do whatever they want, with or without his approval. And so despite initially questioning if the show's style of comedy and storytelling could work on anything other than short-form episodes, he agreed to make the SpongeBob movie as a challenge, to see if he and his team could translate the show into a feature. And I think the worst part is, he completely succeeded. The movie was beloved by audiences and critics alike, which only gave Nick more incentive to push SpongeBob even further. Stephen had been talking about Nick's interest in making a SpongeBob movie from as far back as April 2002, but in those exact same interviews, he was already expressing his need for a break. And so, he had a solution. To leave. He was done. And while his initial hope was that Nickelodeon would allow the show to end after the movie, for whatever reason he eventually changed his mind and put SpongeBob in the hands of Paul Tibbitt. The rest is history, really. Despite more people nowadays attempting to show their appreciation for a lot of episodes after the first movie, there's no denying that the show's reputation had rapidly declined, many hoping it would have ended with Stephen Hillenburg's departure. Though without him, SpongeBob isn't SpongeBob. The hate for what the series had become after Hillenburg's departure really reached a breaking point with the announcement of these spin-offs shortly after his death. Nickelodeon executives being quoted saying they wanted SpongeBob to become their own Marvel universe, which is just a horrible way of phrasing it. To people, it came off like a real misunderstanding and betrayal of what Stephen wanted for his creation. And so they'll continue to remind folks that what Nickelodeon is doing with SpongeBob is a complete spit in the face to what Stephen wanted. But is this what Stephen wanted? This discussion has been going on for the past 5 years, and it wasn't until recently that I finally decided to ask myself, when did Stephen say that he didn't want any SpongeBob spin-offs? The guy hasn't done that many interviews, it can't be that hard to find. And so I got to looking and gathered all the ones I could find. And it made me come to, in retrospect, a pretty obvious realization. He didn't really mean it. Not to say he didn't feel that way at the time, but if you take a look at the dates, it becomes pretty clear that a lot of this cynicism he had towards the SpongeBob franchise came from how draining of an experience working on the movie was. Again, that gumball story that started all of this, where he seemed at his most hopeless about the state of SpongeBob, came less than 2 weeks before the film's premiere. He's been pretty vocal about how grueling of an experience the production was, mainly in their attempt to translate the pipeline used to make an 11-minute episode into a 75-minute feature. This is when SpongeBob's popularity was reaching its peak and it was clearly not something he was prepared for. These come off like the honest events of a man who was simply tired. It's not uncommon for creators to see their characters as their children. And so imagine seeing what only 5 years ago was a series of doodles and mere concepts finally come to fruition in a way you're proud of, only for it to get bigger than you could ever imagine. It's gotta be like seeing your kid become a child celebrity. Sure, for some parents they'd be ecstatic at the prospect, but for others, it's gotta feel strange and as if they've begun leaving your grasp. Everybody wanting a piece of them with their own ideas of what they want them to do, what they want them to be. This would probably make that person pretty cynical. Like their creation is no longer truly theirs. When I read Paul Tibbitt's quote about Stephen referring to Nick making as SpongeBob babies, I don't see that as him saying he would never be interested in something like that. Instead, I see it as him expressing his worries of how much SpongeBob is leaving his grasp. That if Nickelodeon wanted to do it, they would, with or without his approval. But even if it was in reference to him never wanting to do an idea like that, it then becomes a question of, would he stand by it? Like, this isn't even a quote coming from Stephen. This isn't him telling an interviewer how awful of an idea SpongeBob babies would be. It's someone recounting a joke their friend had made without any of the context that goes along with it. Like, Stephen was on record saying he didn't even think doing a first SpongeBob movie was a good idea, but only did it as a challenge to himself to see if he could. Clearly, the man is capable of changing his mind. It's the same thing as people bringing up how he never wanted to do a sequel. Again, seemed pretty adamant it wouldn't be happening. Lo and behold. People always leave out some of that SpongeBob babies quote too. They never focus on how it starts. The full quote reads, "In the animation business, there always used to be this sort of joke. When you run out of ideas, you just do Muppet Babies. Steve would always say to me, one of these days, they're gonna want to make SpongeBob babies. That's when I'm out of here." With even this small bit of added context, it becomes pretty apparent this was all in reference to his worry that the show would eventually run out of ideas, and that he wouldn't want to be a part of it anymore if he felt like he had nothing more to do or say. Simply using SpongeBob babies as the example. And exactly when Stephen felt like he was done, he was out of there. These were the words of a man who was clearly burnt out. The only other time he was ever on record talking about SpongeBob spin-offs was in 2009, when he said he didn't see any happening. But again, this comes off more like him saying he doesn't see how it would work, not that it couldn't. All these quotes people like to cherry pick continuously seem to ignore the simple fact that for a time, Stephen just felt overwhelmed by SpongeBob. It's like seeing a picture of your mother. You don't want to see a picture of your mother everywhere. But like I said, the guy's mindset clearly changed over time. That not only was he aware of the SpongeBob spin-offs, but that he approved of them. I think something important worth noting about this is that before Stephen returned to the series with the second movie, he hadn't had any major involvement with SpongeBob in over 10 years. I think what we saw here was him getting some much needed time away from SpongeBob. Once you're no longer in all that stress, it gives you the chance to appreciate what you did enjoy while working on it. Distance makes the heart grow fonder, and we saw just that as Stephen decided to stick around to oversee the series again for the rest of his life. Sitting next to Steve in the studio, watching and chuckling as another show came together for the 500 and somethingth time, the obvious occurred to me. Even as Steve clings to this one life, we will all laugh with his sponge and, with him, forever. I'm sure so long had passed that he was able to just tune out all the noise. By 2015, SpongeBob was, and still to this day is, huge. But definitely nowhere near as on the level as when that first film came out. And so now, there was no pressure of being at the helm of the biggest thing ever. Now, he could just get back to what he enjoyed most. Working on something with his friends and having fun. Despite how stressful of an experience the first movie was to make, the part he refers to most fondly was when he and his friends locked themselves in a room for 3 months and got to just write and draw. The parts he enjoyed the least was everything that came with being so good at that. Sure, SpongeBob was still this multi-billion-dollar franchise, but from reading and listening to interviews with the guy during and after that break, you can really tell that he had reached some sort of acceptance of it all, which also allows him to more clearly explain why he got such a strong reaction to what was happening around the time it blew up.
I didn't really think that it would become more of a mainstream show. I didn't really see that coming. It just really kind of crept up on me. And I turn around and there's this giant mural on the wall of SpongeBob. And it's just kind of like, I didn't even know that it was there. Things like that, they just sort of all add up to this thing where you realize it's bigger than you are. It is like Frankenstein.
And even though he chose to leave the show in 2004, he never truly could stay away. Even if in the most minor of ways, Stephen had admitted that he still checked in on the crew at times to make sure they were staying true to his vision, staying true to SpongeBob. He still cared and expressed that, despite his issues in working with Nickelodeon. At the end of the day, your identity is not in who you work for. Your identity is inside of you. That's actually a great quote. Who said that? what? And no matter how much you think SpongeBob may have continued to decline in quality or how much you dislike the spin-offs, I don't think there's any denying that there will always be that piece of Stephen Hillenburg's creative voice that shines through it. And because of that, your creation never truly can outlive you. It's an extension of you, your ideas, your emotions, your passions. And as long as that passion is remembered, then you'll always live on.